Chapter 2 Midnight Visitor. Andy saw the little head disappear, come up again, then the whole body start to spin as the dog approached the whirlpool. He loped Sonny toward her and dropped from the saddle. He didn't dare put the sorrel into that mass of churning mud. Running around his horse, he reached the edge of the bank, but there was no sign of Pocket. He leaned over, trying to look under the mass of jammed logs at the foot of the pool. There was no chance to reach under it and pull the dog out. No possible way to save her life. Was the terrier pinned under there, drowning? Slowly drowning? "Hey, look!" he heard Sally yell. He stood up and turned in time to see a bit of white flash past Sally, like a piece of paper blowing in the high wind. Pocket was very much alive indeed. "Well, I'll be dogged." Andy mounted and rode back. "Where did she come out of?" he asked. "She must have climbed out while you were getting off your horse," Sally said. "She swims faster than an otter." When they reached home, Pocket refused to come into the house, but Andy put some raw meat out on the porch, and when he came out after supper, the food had gone, and so had Pocket somewhere under the porch. As he returned to the living room, Andy was still wondering about the Worthingtons, the homestead's former owners. Did they hold a clue to the mystery of the dog and the prowler? Uncle Wes might know if he cared to talk. A big, quiet man with graying hair and a strong, thick body. Wes looked tired tonight as he sat by the open fire in his big chair. He had just picked up the weekly paper published in the town 40 miles away. Andy tried a few questions, but Wes, interested in the news, answered briefly and went on reading. Andy knew there was nothing to do but wait, maybe after the paper was finished. "Well," Uncle Wes said, looking up, "another old-timer's gone. Professor McCoy fell off his horse and died of heart trouble." "A professor?" Andy asked, anxious to start his uncle on any subject. "How could he be an old-timer?" "Oh, we call him Professor 'cause he read so many books," Wes said, rolling a cigarette. That was good, Andy thought. His uncle was beginning to feel like reminiscing about the old days. "Read all winter and prospected all summer," Wes went on. "Quite a character. Says here he was supposed to have left a lot of gold cached away." Andy pricked up his ears. "How did they know that?" he asked. "Did they leave a will or something?" "No, not the professor. He didn't believe in wills or banks. Claimed he had his own dust stashed away somewhere. The only thing is, according to the paper here, he never told anyone, not even his wife, where it was." Wes lit his cigarette and took a deep draw. "Of course, all those old-time prospectors were terrible liars. If all the gold they said they'd hidden ever showed up, this would be the wealthiest county in America." "Then you don't think that the professor really buried anything, I suppose?" Andy said, watching his uncle narrowly. Wes grinned. "Next to Worthington, the professor told the biggest whoppers in the county. Used to hang around a lot with Worthington down at your ranch, trying to outright lie him." Andy sat up slowly. A light glowed in his eyes, and Sally, sitting across the room sewing, watched the excitement grow on his face. "Uncle Wes," Andy tried to control his voice, as though he didn't care. "Somebody's been digging holes on my ranch and pulling stuff out of the walls. Do you think, maybe?" Uncle Wes smiled and picked up the paper. "Maybe the professor buried $1 million under your saddle house, Andy," he said, starting to read again. "But I doubt it. There wasn't a word of truth in the old devil." "Maybe not," Andy said, jumping from his chair. "But I'm taking no chances. If there's hidden gold on my place, I'm gonna be the one to dig it up. Drive me down in the station wagon, will you, Sally? I'm moving into the wigwam right now, but fast." An hour later, as the last bars of sunlight struck golden sparks from the mountain peaks, Andy found himself alone for the first time on his homestead. Sally had driven him over via the 9-mile bridge, bringing a sleeping bag and enough food to make breakfast. Before leaving, she had promised to ride over early in the morning while the river was low, bringing Sonny. Now, sitting on the platform in front of the bunkhouse, Andy leaned a battered old kitchen chair against the wall and looked over his property. Dreaming of what it would be like in a few years to come, he became so entranced with the future that he even forgot his wild thoughts of buried treasure. He saw in his mind's eye the new corrals free of broken posts and baling wire, a big fence for the bunch with a long hay rack for the mares and colts, and a special small corral and barn for the quarter-horse stallion he wanted to own someday. He would have to extend his fields and irrigation ditches so that he would have enough hay to feed his stock in the winter, and to increase his water supply he would build a dam around the spring that sprouted from the base of the rim rock half a mile away. And the main house? All that star-covered burlap would have to come down. He would put in wallboard and replace the stove with a great stone fireplace. He was so lost in his dream that he hardly noticed the peaks fade into darkness, but his eye caught the sudden movement in the sagebrush. At the point where the sage stopped and the weeds of the yard began, something crept along close to the ground. Andy almost jumped from his chair, then held himself back. It was Pocket, a bedraggled, wet, tired-looking Pocket, snooping around in the brush. Andy decided to stay quiet until he saw the miniature dog was hunting. The terrier coursed around among the brambles and the cactus until she came to the place where the station wagon had stopped. Then she began sniffing furiously and running in tight circles. Picking up a trail, she started to follow it toward the bunkhouse. She approached Andy, snuffing her way to within a few yards of him, then raised her head, cocked her ears forward, and gazed straight into his eyes. Andy tried not to laugh or to make a move. Pocket liked him, but this time it was up to her to decide how much, and whether she wanted to make friends. And she stood like a statue, her legs straight, her nose pointed directly at him, then her tiny stump of a tail wagged twice. "Hello, Pocket," Andy said quietly. As though this were what she had been waiting for, she slowly advanced, and her tail began to wave again, this time with more confidence. When Andy leaned toward her, she wagged so hard that the rear end of her body almost left the ground. Finally, her nose touched Andy's hand, and he realized that she was shivering with wet and cold. She had crossed this river again, all by herself, in search of him. Andy let his hand run down the dripping back. "Why, you poor little dog," he said. "You're freezing to death." With one jump, Pocket landed in his lap. "Gee," Andy wrapped his arms around the shivering body. "It looks to me, Pocket, as though maybe now I got a dog as well as a horse. I wonder whether Sonny'll be jealous." Pocket didn't answer him except to drive her cold nose further under his arm. "We've got to warm you up, Half-Pint," Andy said. "Let's go inside and make ourselves at home." The nights were cool in this high valley of the Rockies, and Andy was glad to light the stove. He spread his shirt out in front of the fire, and the dog curled up on it, her stumpy tail wagging her thanks. Andy, a candle flickering beside his sleeping bag, had just slipped out of his clothes and was sliding between the covers when he heard a terrific scrambling noise. A snarling Pocket shot wildly across his chest as though fired from a gun and landed in the far corner. Andy sat up in time to see the terrier grab a pack rat almost as big as she was, and with one short snap of her jaws and a quick twist, break its neck. She shook it to make sure it was dead, and then she went to the door carrying it in her mouth. "Say," Andy's eyes widened, "you're gonna be quite a help around here. I think I can give you just about all the hunting you want." He climbed out of bed, opened the door, and watched her go. A few minutes later, when Andy let her back in again, she looked so proud and happy, saying, "See, that's my job, and I'm the dog that can do it too." "Okay," Andy said. "You're hired. Now let's get some sleep." Andy snuggled down under the covers, and when he blew out the candles, he could see a shaft of moonlight slipping through the dusty window. Pocket, having rumpled up Andy's shirt to make what she considered a proper bed, settled down by the stove. Stretching out, relaxing comfortably, Andy wondered if Old Man Worthington and the professor had spent hours here together, telling of strange adventures in the mountains when they were hunting for gold. Had the professor told Worthington where his gold dust was? Had they worked out some sort of plan for hiding it? Maybe right here on the ranch near where he was laying. Andy drifted off to sleep, still wondering. Outside, in the moonlight, a doe followed by a speckled fawn jumped noiselessly over the wire fence by the back gate and started grazing near the main house. And a little ermine that lived in the ancient woodpile stuck his nose out from among the logs, ready to start his nightly ramble. Because a cloud, drifting slowly, gradually covered the moon, and a breath of wind ruffled the cottonwoods, the animals failed to notice a shadow against a clump of wild rose bushes down by the main gate. When it moved, looming for a moment against the sky, it was only a patch of darkness, a black something disappearing behind the root cellar. The doe and fawn kept cropping the grass, and the little ermine came all the way out of his hiding place to sniff the breeze. Again the shadow appeared, flitting like a ghost across the yard to the big tree near the corral. If the wind had been blowing from the east, the animals would have scented it. But nothing happened until a clinking sound outside the main road brought the doe's head up. Her mule-like ears questioned the wind, then, turning swiftly, she and the dappled fawn leaped the fence, white tails signaling alarm, and loped into the sagebrush. The ermine watched all this from his log, then deciding to take no chances, he withdrew carefully into the fortress of the woodpile. Again, the clink came from the road, sounding as though a horse with a loose horseshoe were pawing the ground. Inside the bunkhouse, the terrier raised her head from the rumpled shirt, her tiny black ears poking forward, listening, and a miniature growl rose in her throat. Keeping her nose close to the floor, she went down to the door and sniffed at the crack. Then her ears went down, and the growl changed to a whine, and with her tail between her legs, she crawled over to the sleeping boy. Andy felt her wet nose touch his face. Struggling from under waves of sleep, he found the dog pushing him, rooting his head back. Before he was fully awake, Pocket dove into the sleeping bag and with muffled whines burrowed her way until she was nothing but a shivering lump at the bottom. "What's the matter with you?" Andy grunted. "Trying to steal my bed?" But the little dog only quivered. Andy rubbed his eyes. It was funny, he thought. Up to now, Pocket had been unafraid. What was scaring her? Some animal? A bear, perhaps? Or a human prowler? Andy climbed out of the bag, crossed on the floor bare feet, and opening the door crack, he peeked into the yard. The cloud still covered the moon, and he could only see it clearly for a short distance. He had about decided that the dog had only climbed into his bed to keep warm when he heard a sound, something between a scuff and a twang, from the direction of the corral. It could be an animal, Andy thought, but the picture that flashed through his mind was the boot heel caught in a bit of wire. Andy closed the door softly, and without lighting the candle, he shrugged into his clothes. All of a sudden, feeling very much alone, he wished for a gun and a flashlight. Glancing around the cabin, Andy saw nothing, not even a piece of stove wood worth using as a weapon. And as he slipped through the door, he realized that his best, perhaps his only, defense was the darkness itself. Silently, he crept toward the corral, stopping every few seconds to listen. He was working his way through a tangle of bent posts and baling wire when he heard a slight creaking noise. His heart thumped hard against his chest. That was no animal. No bear could unhook and open the saddle house door. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard the clinking sound, the pawing of a horse with a loose shoe. And he felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, and sweat broke out on his forehead. Was there another man, a lookout perhaps, out there on the road? Was he caught between them? Andy clenched his teeth and reminded himself that this was his ranch, he owned it, and if anybody else was here they had no right to be. He must defend his property, and no matter what he did, the law was on his side. Andy tried to swallow his fear, and taking a firm grip on himself, he began to move silently across the corral. When he reached the wall of the saddle house, he bent down and put his ear to a crack, listening, straining every sense to pick up some sign, some movement that would locate the trespasser. The wind ruffled the cottonwood leaves, the sound of water rushing over the rocks drifted up from the river bar, but there was no hint of the enemy that came from the little cabin. Then, to the crouching Andy, the idea that whoever it was in there was listening too, waiting for some sign, some movement. And what of the sound he heard by the gate? Was someone stalking him from behind, creeping up so quietly that he wouldn't have a chance? Just then, Andy heard a slight thump from inside the saddle house. It was the only movement of a boot heel, but to Andy it was as loud as a crack of thunder. He felt his breath drawing sharply, his muscles tense. The prowler had been waiting, suspicious, but now he evidently felt safe. He was going ahead. Andy heard the rusty hinge creak, and the door of the open. Then it was a snapping of fingers. So that was it. The stranger was after Pocket. The man in the saddle house was the tramp in the pickup truck. That's who he was. And he had come back for his dog. Andy thought of the shivering lump at the bottom of his sleeping bag. Pocket was afraid of this man. Nuts to this guy. Let the terrier pick her own company. Andy heard more sounds from the saddle house. The man must be searching the bin, he thought, and now was the time to get closer, to slide forward to the point where he could watch the door. He would wait until the man came out, and then maybe he would get some hint as to who the stranger was. Moving an inch at a time, Andy started forward, crouching so low that the muscles in his knees ached. He didn't dare touch the walls of the cabin because the chinking was old and loose and might fall at his touch. He had about 3 feet to go. He almost reached the corner when suddenly the ground gave way under him. He had forgotten the trench dug by the stranger, and he had fell headlong into it. In the silence it sounded like an avalanche, and as his face hit the dirt, in spite of himself, he grunted in pain.